I had a conversation with a family member recently around the topic of adult ADHD. It dawned on me that this subject is not really discussed much in women and is typically considered an affliction in children. And I'm doing air quotes when I say affliction. I started looking into ADHD in midlife women and was surprised to find that it goes largely undiagnosed in women and girls, as the signs are not as obvious as they are in men and boys. So what are the signs? It can be substance use disorders, such as with alcohol or drugs, anxiety disorders, and that could include maybe social anxiety as well, obsessive compulsive disorder, sleep disorders, and even eating disorders can point to ADHD in women. What may also result is difficulty in the work environment, maybe holding down a job for an extended period of time, or even with relationships. It can also point to the inability to start tasks or manage multiple tasks. Our guest today has made it her mission to normalize the discussion around ADHD and midlife women. And she also points to the fact that managing it doesn't have to be so daunting. Health, wellness, career, relationships, and everything in between. We're removing the taboo from what really matters in midlife. I'm your host, Michelle Folan, and this is Asking for a Friend. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am really super excited to cover the topic of adult ADHD. Today's guest has spent the last 6+ years coaching women to change their mindset and reframe their identities so they can finally recognize and lean into their gifts and abilities. And her own diagnosis of ADHD as an adult has provided her clients a deeper understanding of ADHD characteristics and traits, and also strategies to improve executive functioning. She's an author, a public speaker, and the host of the very popular podcast, Women and ADHD. Welcome to the show, Katy Weber.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
It's really, really nice to have you here. This topic came up. Someone close to me, we started talking about ADHD in adults a little while back. I went on a mission to find someone that could address this, and I think I found the perfect guest. So thank you for being here. I wanted to just start off the interview with you just telling us a little bit more about you, where you're from, and your family.
Well, I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, and I've been living in New York State for the last 20 years. Fell in love, got married, and now I'm trapped here, as I like to say. And so we live in the Hudson Valley of New York, which is just about 2 hours outside of New York City. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 45 2 years ago, and it just rocked my world. It was absolutely profound to have this diagnosis, and I have 2 kids. I have a daughter who's 15 and a son who is 11, and since my diagnosis, both of my kids have been diagnosed with ADHD. That has been another journey too, in terms of parenting kids with ADHD and really kind of understanding it, and yeah, it's live and breathe it now.
I do want to get into that because I think addressing children with ADHD, particularly when they get into adulthood, is where a lot of us are right now in that space. But in regard to your own journey with this and your eventual diagnosis, how did all of that come about?
Where do I even start with this? I feel like, do I go? I'm like, I was born on a dark and stormy night. But my therapist, who I've been seeing for years and years, she was actually diagnosed with ADHD because her middle schooler son was diagnosed with ADHD. And I think I was very fortunate to have her on her own journey of what does ADHD look like? How is it experienced in adulthood, especially as an adult woman? And I think she started to recognize a lot of signs in me. And so for years, she recommended, I think you might want to look into this. And my reaction was, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not hyperactive. I don't have a deficit of attention. I don't think. I don't really even know what that means. I didn't understand. I just had this stereotype of a little boy who couldn't sit still and who was naughty. And I was like, do you really think of me like that? Like, just thought it was so strange that she would even suggest it, because I really just didn't understand it. I think there were a few things that I talked about throughout my therapy sessions that were a little markers for her. I would talk about the fact that I thought I might have a learning disorder from school. There were a lot of things about school that I struggled with, even though I was clearly an intelligent person, but I did really poorly in school. And so that was a marker for her. And then I think I started thinking about the fact that I might have bipolar, because I had this very extreme pendulum where I would have manic energy and interest, and I would start a new business and I would get really excited. It was excitable and excited about things. And then I would burn out and the pendulum would swing back to a state of real depression and despondency where I just couldn't get off the couch. I was seeing that pendulum in my life. I was coming to her thinking, do you think I might have bipolar? And she said, you need to look into ADHD. We would kind of go through this cycle. And then the pandemic hit. Lockdown. My 2 kids were doing remote schooling and my husband was working from home and I didn't have a housekeeper anymore. And all of a sudden it was like I was the chef, the teacher, the cleaner, everything. I was really struggling, as many mothers and women did during that period of time. I just felt like I couldn't get anything done. I felt like I was in this state of suspended animation where I was just sitting around waiting, like everybody's butler, to when my kids were going to freak out about the Wi-Fi being out, or you can't get on Zoom, or I'm hungry, and I'd be like, what? I just fed you. Also, all the things that were happening internationally with the health crisis, like just in this state of absolute chaos and really, really struggling to get anything done, it felt like. I was talking to my therapist about this, and she said, okay, look, can you please look into ADHD? I took an online test that was just a generic one for adults. And there were some things I related to, but a lot of the things I didn't relate to. I didn't feel like I couldn't sit still, and I felt like a lot of the things that were sort of generic ADHD symptoms, I didn't relate to. And then I took one that was specifically for women. And that was where it hit me like a ton of bricks, where I was like, oh, the questions were much more around how much shame do you hold around the state of your house? I feel like overwhelmed when you get to a grocery store. They were really questions that hit me hard in this visceral way where I was like, oh, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about sitting in a class or fidget spinners or any of that stuff. We're talking about a lot of the emotional stuff that happens around feeling disorganized and chaotic. And that started that journey where I then got diagnosed and yeah.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Right.
I want to go back to Katy in school. When you were in high school and then even college, now looking back, do you now see that it was probably ADHD at that point in your life?
Oh, absolutely. The signs were there all along throughout all of my report cards. Nobody knew what to look for back then. It's starting off as early as when I was in kindergarten. My kindergarten teacher, I was originally left-handed and she forced me to become right-handed. So that dates me in terms of the draconic school system of the 1970s and 80s. And that started this complaint about my handwriting all the time. And now I look back and I'm like, well, of course my handwriting was terrible. You forced me to write with the wrong hand. But I saw a lot of patterns where I was put into the gifted program in the 3rd grade. And once I was in the gifted program, I went from being a child whose report cards always talked about how I was a leader and how I was very enthusiastic and very bright, to a lot more of these report card comments like, Katy has a lot of potential, but Katy is bright, and I was seeing a lot of that where it was like, Katy is bright, but she's disorganized. She doesn't finish things. She gets really excited about a project, but she has a really hard time completing it. She gets very distracted in groups. She's very chatty. I saw a lot of these comments over and over again in my report cards over the years where it said, Katy needs to try harder. More work, more studying will help. Seeing this potential in me, but also remembering that I didn't know what that potential was, and I didn't didn't know how to reach it. And I felt like there was a real frustration when I was in school that everybody saw this version of me that I didn't know how to live up to. I kept waiting for people to kick me out of the gifted program, and it never happened. A lot of the comments I got were things like, would do so much better if she really applied herself. I feel like at some point, especially in high school, those comments then started to say like, Katie's just not showing up to class. I had a real truancy problem in high school because I feel like that little girl just like gave up on trying, because I felt like a lot of the times I was trying and it wasn't being recognized as trying. I didn't know how to do better. I didn't even know what to ask for. I see a lot of those comments, and I think a lot of women I've spoken to who were diagnosed in adulthood have very similar comments about the disorganization and the chattiness. We're daydreamers, we were doodlers, but we weren't disruptive. There was no reason for a teacher to think there was anything other than just those were our personality quirks. It wasn't an obvious learning disorder.
I've always thought that a lot of kids with ADHD typically are some of the brighter kids. It's just trying to harness that for good, trying to keep that energy going in the right direction. High school, a little truant. That cracks me up. I mean, then once you got to college, how did that manifest in college for you?
When I did finally get to college, it took me a couple tries. I had to redo my senior year in Toronto because my grades were terrible and nobody would accept me. So I went back, I did another year, and then I finally got into university. And my first year was awful. I partied all the time. I felt really guilty about wasting my parents' money. I was very lost and was very socially oriented, and so I dropped out. And I thought, this is not for me. I'm not smart enough for this. You just can't study. After I dropped out, I spent a year traveling and camping and being a nomad. And I realized, no, I really do want to go back and get my degree. I went back, and it was that motivation to get my degree. Once I realized I needed to do this and that I didn't want to not have it, I was highly motivated. I ended up on the dean's list, and I worked really hard, and I did really well in school after I went back. I just needed to have that motivation coming from myself and not feeling like I owed it to my parents or anybody else.
I think also there's this amount of maturity.
Right.
That kicks in too. Say, all right, I can do this now. But back to the original thing is that why is ADHD less diagnosed in women and girls? And I think you're pointing to that. We're not typically the ones fidgeting terribly in our seats. That may be because there's a little bit more self-control.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think for one thing, yeah, there's more self-control from girls in terms of, I think we're socialized to behave and be polite and be less disruptive than boys in general. I think there is a sense that girls are just developmentally able to have a little more physical self-control. I think there's all of those factors lead to girls being less disruptive. And I think that it's the teachers who are finding that the kids who are disrupting the class and disrupting the lessons, the teachers then contact the parents and say, hey, you should get this kid diagnosed. And that's just not happening a lot with girls. And I think at home, parents aren't seeing these signs as anything other than like, it's a family quirk. This is how we are. Not really seeing that struggle of girls really working hard to try to keep it together. And like you said, they're often very bright and often do well. There's the at what cost is not quite evident for little girls, and they end up going under the radar.
One of the questions I got from the listeners was, how do I know as an adult if I do have ADHD?
Great question. I think there are a few from all of the women I've interviewed and interacted with over the last 2 years. There are some pretty good universal markers that if you relate to this on a deeply personal level, you might want to look into ADHD. One of them is you've been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, as that combination is very, very common precursor to women who are diagnosed with ADHD. Many of us have been diagnosed with another mood disorder, and it doesn't feel like it fits, especially the depression diagnosis. Many of us feel like, why am I depressed. It's confused. My life is fine. It just doesn't feel like I relate to that diagnosis. But I think a lot of the time we get diagnosed with depression and anxiety because when you have undiagnosed ADHD, you often go through life feeling like everybody else got the manual but you. Feeling very broken a lot of the time. Why is this easy for other people but really difficult for me? I'm trying. It's not for lack of trying, but I think oftentimes the depression comes from feeling like I'm really, really trying hard, but it's being interpreted as I'm lazy or I don't care. We see that a lot in friendships and relationships, in marriages and at our jobs. I'm trying really, really hard, but the outcome is not reflecting my intent. That's something I see a lot. If that feels relatable, I would start looking into ADHD hashtags on Instagram or TikTok. And again, feeling like those can be really, really great platforms for self-exploration and self-diagnosis. And then there's also self-tests can be really helpful. They're the one that I took specifically for women. It was written by Sari Solden, who's a psychologist, and that's at the Attitude Magazine website, which is one of the resources on my website because I'm like, that's where it really starts. We start really getting curious about like, oh, you mean everybody isn't like that? Everybody doesn't feel this way? And realizing that, no, these are actually very common traits of ADHD.
Any of this stuff I will put in the show notes. We'll make sure that your contact information and any of the resources that you mentioned we'll put in there as well. Mm-hmm. When you and I first spoke, we did talk a little bit about adult relationships, how ADHD can affect your close personal relationships, whether it's a partner or with even your own children. When you were going through this process, did you start to understand some of your own dynamics with your marriage?
Oh, yeah. My husband and I have been together for 20 years at this point. I used to ask him all the time, why are you with me? I always felt like I had hit the jackpot with him. He was so out of my league, this guy. He's so together. He's so organized. He's just a great father, a great partner. I always felt like, why are you with me? I'm such a hot mess. He would always make some sort of jokey response like, oh, I don't know, you smell nice, or I don't know, you were here. And we'd kind of laugh, but I could never really, it really bothered me. Like I really had this question, like, what are you doing with me?
We'll be right back after this quick break. There are many wonderful things about midlife to celebrate, but vaginal dryness is not on that list. Add relief to your routine like I did with Reverie from Bonafide Health. Reverie is naturally powered with hyaluronic acid and scientifically validated to rejuvenate vaginal tissue and replenish moisture. No mess, no stress. Go to hellobonafide.com and use code AFAF25 at checkout to receive 25% off your subscription for any of Bonafide's sexual health and wellness products. You deserve lasting comfort, so check out Reverie at hellobonafide.com. Welcome back to the show.
When I was diagnosed with ADHD and really started thinking about like looking at myself in a very, very different light and realizing why I had such poor self-esteem issues. We can get into that a little bit more about why people with ADHD have really, really poor self-esteem. But once I started looking at some of my strengths and what I brought to the relationship and what I brought to the table, I felt like, wow, I owe it to my husband to recognize these in myself. And I was like, it must be really, really difficult to be in a relationship with somebody for 20 years. They're your favorite person in the world. You love them more than anything. And all they do is talk about themselves poorly. Wouldn't it be nice if I talked about myself in a nicer way, not only to my husband, but then what would it look like if I told myself I was a great mom? What would that look like? And I realized that I had this story about who I was, that I was terrible, that I was just a trash human, and I was lucky that anybody wanted to be around me. I feel like that has really profoundly affected, especially my marriage, but even just how I parent, how I operate in the world.
I would think friendships too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Seeing your value in a friendship and what you bring to the table is huge in getting friends and then keeping friends. This is really good. I keep coming up with more questions as we're going here. We know there's a hereditary component to ADHD. You mentioned that your kids are also diagnosed with ADHD. How has this helped you in your parenting in regard to helping them manage their ADHD?
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I have a girl and a boy, and I immediately, when I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was like, oh yeah, my son has it for sure. He and I are cut from the same cloth. He has a lot of the same issues in school, really difficult with concentration. And he's younger, and he has more of the sort of physical outbursts and stuff. I never would have thought my daughter had it. She has a 95 honors student, very organized, lots of anxiety, and really, really wants to do well, very put together. It wasn't until I started interviewing women who were diagnosed in adulthood where I started seeing this pattern of women who were also did very, very well in school, had very high grades, and then they developed a diagnosis of anxiety and depression because they became perfectionists and they were white knuckling it through, being on the PTA or being this perfect person, and this idea of this swan that everybody says, wow, you're doing so well and you're so together and you're so organized, but like behind the scenes, they just feel like they're falling apart. I was like, oh, I see that in my daughter. And I started to recognize that the anxiety, the levels that she had as a teenager were not normal, and that this was not healthy. And so I was like, how, that's when we got her diagnosed. But it's also kind of been interesting to see how little there is in place to help with that. And, after she was diagnosed, we were doing a 504 meeting at her school where I wanted to have some accommodations put in place for her. And the teachers were like, I don't understand why we're here. She does really well in school. She participates. She's not struggling. Why does she need accommodations? And I sort of felt like they were accusing me of being like a tiger mom where, where they were like, is a 95 not good enough? Does she have to have an 100? And I was like, no, you don't see the behind the scenes. Like I see a very different kid who comes home and cries over maintaining these marks. I think your answer was about being a parent, and I think, or your question was about being a parent, and I think for me, the biggest change has been what I can recognize in my kids in terms of what do you need right now? That there would have been a tendency to kind of say, oh yeah, everything's fine, or if they weren't doing well in something, there was a tendency to be like, oh, well, that's fine. Not everybody is good at calculus. But if they're trying and they really want to succeed, what I can now recognize, like, okay, you are trying. What's standing in your way right now? What do you need to do well?
Yeah.
Is that clear? I guess feels like I'm being very obtuse, but
No.
It's really about seeing like, what do you need right now has been a big change for me.
What I see is the anxiety behind the perfection and test anxiety.
Yep.
So by providing that child that does get anxious, that they have a little extra time to take a test, that can absolutely affect performance. I hesitated to ask you this question because I know the first thing that people say is, oh, our children are over-medicated. I know there's some controversy around people being overdiagnosed. That's fine. But until you have walked in the shoes of someone who either has ADHD or you have a child or a relative with it, you don't really understand the impact of it. When you and I talked a couple weeks ago, we did talk about medication and you had your own journey. I forget where you landed. Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
I did try medication right away after I was diagnosed. I was very excited about it. It worked great. I tried a stimulant. I was very nervous about it because I thought, oh gosh, the term stimulant, I was thinking like, oh, is this going to feel like I'm on cocaine or something? I was like, I don't need more, agitation in my life. And it had really the opposite effect. It was really very calming and it was great. But I started to get side effects where I was feeling very agitated and very restless, for lack of a better word. And I sort of felt like the side effects started to outweigh the benefits. And then I'd gone off it, and I've tried a few since then, and I'm not on anything right now for ADHD. But my daughter is now on stimulant medication. We're trying her as the guinea pig before we try my son. And it's been amazing to watch the changes in her executive function in terms of she was always procrastinating with her homework and leaving it till the last minute and then having a panic attack. And I've noticed the biggest change has been that she's just able to get past that paralysis and really sort of say, okay, this is what I have ahead of me today. This is what I'm going to do. And she's able to do it in a fast pace. And so that's really improving her sense of self and her self-esteem. One of the arguments I feel like is important for a parent to weigh if they are really, really nervous about giving their child, when their brain is developing, giving their child medication. I always say, this is a time where their brain is developing. And so if you can help them with their executive functioning skills so that they can have higher self-esteem, this is a pivotal time in their life to have their brain developing when they're getting this kind of self-esteem and executive function improvement. That's going to last a lifetime. I'm in the boat of medicate as early as possible because this is when the medication is going to help their developing brains. They might not even need it into adulthood.
Can you define executive functioning?
Executive functioning is really your ability to make decisions. And I always feel like I'm terrible at describing this on the fly because, I'm not a psychologist, but it's really about planning and follow through. And it's something that is part of our frontal lobe, and it's something that some people are really good at, and some people are not. It needs to be much more of an intentional. You take about something like laundry. Laundry is something that involves a lot of decision making and a lot of executive functioning skills, and some people don't really think about that. They're just like laundry. Whereas there's a lot of steps involved. You have to put your clothes in the washer. Then you have to remember to take them out before 3 days have gone by. And then you put them in the dryer, and then you have to take them out and make sure that they're dry enough. And then you have to fold them, and then you have to put them away. And so there's like many, many steps. For somebody with ADHD, each one of those steps is separate and needs to be worked on and intentionally thought about. Whereas for somebody else, it might just be an effortless domino effect. When we talk about executive function, and it's a term we use a lot around ADHD because that's kind of the core issue, is how often is somebody paralyzed by seemingly easy steps within a system?
Oh, this is making so much sense. I sit here and I'm like, oh, yeah. I'm thinking of someone specific in my life, and I'm going, oh, holy smokes. It's not me, although I can say that I probably do have some ADHD.
Well, I think we all have executive functioning issues here and there in our life. But I think, again, with ADHD, and one of the reasons where it's how much is this affecting me? That's a question a lot of the times it's asked during the diagnosis process, which is this impeding your life? Is this something you really, really struggle with? Do you have a lot of shame around your inability to do this? And how is that affecting you and showing up in your life? I mean, we all forget our keys, but I saw a meme once recently that was like, sure, we all forget our keys. We all go to the bathroom, but if you're doing it 90 times a day, you might want to have that checked out.
Okay, that makes sense. We don't talk about this, but is there some self-medication that happens with people that have ADHD in adulthood?
Yes, I think that substance abuse is quite common with people who have undiagnosed ADHD or even diagnosed ADHD. I think self-medication comes in a lot of forms. Binge eating is a very popular comorbidity with ADHD, and excessive behaviors just around extreme dieting behaviors can also be a sort of something that a lot of people with ADHD have. This idea of we don't have a dimmer switch. We are on or we are off. You tend to go from like 0 to 150 a lot of the time with a new hobby or, a new job or a new relationship. Hyper focusing on a new relationship is also, I'm like, we like to come in hot and see a lot of that in terms of behaviors around alcohol, nicotine too. A lot of people struggle. Another comorbidity with ADHD is addictive personalities.
Smoking is a stimulant.
Nicotine, yeah, absolutely.
I could see where that would play a role.
And caffeine.
Caffeine. My dad, although he was never diagnosed with ADHD, he was a brilliant surgeon, but he struggled to pay attention in school and to really focus. And when he was studying in medical school, he smoked cigarettes.
To focus, yeah.
To focus in order to be able to compete. That eventually, it was his demise. He quit smoking when he started practice. Long story short, he realized later in life when we had some diagnosis of ADHD in the family, he said, oh my God, that was me. It really opened his eyes. The other thing I wanted to ask you, you're not on anything now. How do you manage your own ADHD without medication at this point in your life?
One of the things that frustrates me about an ADHD diagnosis is that oftentimes women especially will get their diagnosis in adulthood and then they'll get a prescription for medication. That's it. That's the doctor will, say, here you go, here's your pill, everything's solved, as though it's diabetes medication or, blood pressure medication. I think that's a real disservice to living productively and happily managing your ADHD, which is really, for me, it's been a much more holistic look at what is my treatment plan. And it's something I work on with my clients too, which is like try to picture a bingo card of treatment plan. And I have that when I work with my clients. We do have something that looks like a bingo card, which is like, what are all the elements in my life that need to be taken care of in this framework? Not only is there movement is a huge part of managing dopamine, which is really an ADHD brain comes down to a deficiency of dopamine. Number one thing you can do is daily exercise. And I don't mean you have to go and do CrossFit every single day of your life, but really just going out for a walk for 10 minutes in nature or just being outside. And movement is a huge part of managing ADHD. Water, nutrition. If you picture this bingo card, it's like we've got nutrition and movement are hugely beneficial to treating ADHD. But then you also think about, okay, what am I getting in terms of therapy or coaching? What am I getting in terms of household management? If I'm in a position to get a housekeeper, am I able to do that? Do I have somebody who is doing chores? Am I feeling like I'm supported as a woman and as a mother especially? And then, where else am I taking care of myself? How am I advocating for my needs? Where am I receiving support? And a lot of it comes down to leaning into what are the things I'm really good at and recognizing, like I was talking about before, what do I bring to the table? But also really letting go of the things you're not good at and being like, can I offload this onto? How can I get someone else to do this for me? And how can I ask for help? And as you know, asking for help is one of the hardest things for a woman, any woman. And it's really important with ADHD to get support.
This is a great segue because I really wanted to talk about your coaching business because you have clients and you work with them. What kind of programs do you offer with your coaching?
One thing I realized very quickly after I started the podcast was how important it was to meet other women and have a community and find your people, as I call it, because I feel like talking about some of these issues around executive function, especially domestic issues that a lot of us have, talking to each other, validating each other's experience and validating that this is not about laziness. This is not about lack of caring, that this is really a brain-based deficiency, and taking some of the shame out of that and injecting some humor into that with community of other ADHD women is so important. It really is also part of the treatment plan. I've done whatever I can to build communities anywhere I can find them. And I often joke that I'm like, building a community of ADHD women is like herding cats, because we have a tendency to like get really excited and then forget other people exist. But I still feel like it's so important to this journey. And so I had created the online community for women off of Facebook, but it's really just very similar in terms of like a place to share resources, a place to vent, a place to reach out and say, hey, does anyone else experience this? It's so important. Crowdsourcing and finding each other is such an important part of our journey. One of the things I also started was a book club, a virtual book club for the seminal, the workbook for women, which is a workbook by Sari Solden, who is the psychologist I mentioned earlier, and another woman, Michelle Frank. They wrote a radical guide for women with ADHD, and it's a workbook. And I listened to it. I almost exclusively listen to books. I don't read. And I listened to the book, and it had all of these workbook questions in it. And I was like, oh, I should buy the workbook and fill these out. These feel really important. And then I bought the workbook and I looked at the questions and I was like, I'm never going to fill these out on my own. I'm going to start a book club and we'll fill them out together. And that created this community where we come together, we talk about the book, but it's also really about sharing our experiences as ADHD women and going over this book and some of the themes together. That has just been so wonderful. I did 3 of them last year and I just want to keep doing them because I just feel it's so rewarding.
You have one coming up in January, don't you?
I have one coming up in January too, and you can find out more about that at my website, womenandadhd.com. That's just been a phenomenal experience, and it's a really great starting point for women who are just exploring this new identity and looking at themselves through this new lens.
I love the group support. I think that is such a wonderful idea. When we get diagnosed with anything, feeling like you're out there on an island all by yourself is the most frustrating and isolating thing. And when you know that you can have that wonderful camaraderie with other women to say, I'm not so odd or strange. There are lots of women like me out there. I think it's just the support is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
You decided along the way here to start a podcast, which I think is very brave because you and I, being midlifers, starting podcasts, knowing absolutely nothing about podcasting, and your show is really popular. You're in the top 0.5% globally for podcasts in your category, and I think that's phenomenal.
It's kind of crazy. I really never started it thinking anything other than my experience was so profound. I really wanted to reach out to other women to find out if their adult diagnosis experience was similar to mine, and let's talk about it. And I was stuck at home during the pandemic and was like, how can I have these conversations with women? I'll create this platform, the podcast, as an excuse to reach out to women, and very quickly realized it was resonating with an enormous audience of women who were also going through this. A lot of women have been diagnosed with ADHD recently, because of this explosion of information out there through social media and word of mouth. It's been like this really incredible time of growth. Like you said, hearing ourselves in other people is incredibly healing and it's incredibly nourishing. Yeah, I think that's why people are listening to these conversations, is they're feeling like this is their therapy.
I've listened to a couple of your shows. I find your guests very fascinating, and how willing people are to talk about their journey. It's all different aspects of ADHD. You've done this, for 2 years now. What have been your biggest learnings in these guests that you've had on the show?
Oh, man, I love that question. Well, first of all, I think the biggest revelation to me was what I was talking about with my daughter and the anxiety and the perfectionism element, that most women who are diagnosed in adulthood actually are the opposite of what you would think an ADHD kid is, and that those girls are being overlooked every day. And how can we help? How can we spread the word? How can we help teachers? How can we help parents realize that there is a lot of struggle happening behind the scenes with those kids? What does the proper channel of help look like for those girls? I think many women with ADHD have a real advocacy piece, which is like, oh, if I can save one person from going through what I went through, it will have all been worth it. I see a lot of women who are, as soon as they were diagnosed, they immediately pivoted into advocacy and education around ADHD, as did I, because it sort of felt like, oh my goodness, I can't believe the signs were there all along, but nobody knew what to look for. And I see so much of that. One of the things that is amazing about ADHD is this childlike enthusiasm and energy when you're excited about something, to really go all in, and to see that in so many women who are behind this movement, so to speak, after having spent so many years feeling confused and minimized by their medical professionals, and really feeling like this diagnosis explains so much. It's like a window opening. And I've often used the metaphor of the phoenix, where it's like feeling like you're at your darkest point when you get this diagnosis, and then suddenly feeling like your whole life is ahead of you. It's amazing. And it's amazing to see that. I've interviewed women from so many different continents and so many different cultural backgrounds, and to see so many of those similar themes has been really, really incredible, to see how many of us around the world are in that same boat.
You brought that up about the cultural differences. Where are we in the United States compared to other countries in our ability to assess ADHD and treat it effectively?
I mean, we're definitely ahead of the pack. in terms of diagnoses, I mean, many more kids are diagnosed in the US than anywhere else. And I think that number is probably around, I know for boys is like 13% of boys are diagnosed with ADHD, whereas like only 6% of girls are diagnosed. But there's really, so it's always sort of felt like it was this boys disorder. And more people are realizing that no, it's just appears very different in girls, but there's no reason to believe it's genetically one gender or the other. But even still, like even in the US, it's only about 5% of adults are diagnosed with ADHD. And I personally believe way more than 5% of the population has it. But, there's some countries where it's been really interesting to talk to guests from Asian countries where even just the language, there is no language for what ADHD is. And so it's been really interesting to think about how different countries approach mental health in general. Executive dysfunction is some concept that is so integral to treating ADHD. And it's not, in some cultures, that just conceptually doesn't exist. I had a guest recently who was from Somalia, and she was talking about how Somali culture is really hospitable to the ADHD brain. ADHD doesn't feel like a disorder in certain environments because if you're not being forced to sit in a classroom and forced to sit at a desk from 9 to 5, your ADHD brain has a lot of freedom to roam and be creative. And so it's not looked at as a disorder. I think in Western countries especially, there's a tendency to pathologize it as a disorder and something that needs to be medicated and treated and healed, as opposed to other cultures where they're like, no, that's just how Uncle Fergus is. And he's all, like, that's just who you are.
Yeah.
There's no sense of pathological sense to these behavior traits.
I think it gives credence to Montessori education, honestly.
Absolutely.
I had thought about that early on. I would think Montessori education would be absolutely beneficial for kids.
Well, a question we talk about a lot on my podcast, which is like, is this a disorder? Is this a superpower? What is this? And kind of what would we rename this ADHD? I ask that of all my guests because it sort of feels like it's only a disorder in environments that are hostile to how you think and operate. And it's only a disability if the wheelchair ramp isn't there for you. Then it's like when we're in situations where we're in environments that help us thrive, it's no longer a disorder. Yeah, that's a conversation we have a lot.
Whether it's a disorder or it's a superpower, I think we can all agree that it's manageable. It's just you have to go out and seek the tools, seek the information, and the support to be able to make your path forward with it. This is something on this podcast that I am a huge advocate for, is that I want women to not suffer in silence. I want women to say, I'm going to take the bull by the horns and I'm going to address this, because this is something that's held me back, and I am going to be my own advocate and make my life better. I think having people like you to normalize things on the show is so incredibly beneficial for women to hear. I just want to thank you so much for being here, and you certainly have opened my eyes, and I cannot wait to share this with my listeners.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the conversation and the curiosity, because I really feel like this is how we're going to affect change, is getting people to understand what this looks like. And these conversations are just really nourishing and so important. So thank you for having me.
I hope we get a chance to catch up again, because for some of my guests, we may have to do round 2, because I get questions after the show. I try to get people to ask me questions prior to the show, but then I get a ton after the show, and then I feel like I have to have a show number 2 to get all those questions answered. So we'll see how that goes.
Absolutely. Anytime. Happy to.
Oh, Katy, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Follow Asking for a Friend on social media outlets and provide a review and share this show wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews and sharing help us grow.